So if you're a fan of my previous channel, then you're probably very aware that I'm a huge fan of the 6th generation of gaming. Now, there are a few reasons for this, but I suppose the lazy and obvious answer is that generation took place during some of my most formative years. The more complex answer, however, is that I believe in the early 2000s the gaming industry was in a bit of a sweet spot for producing exactly what I wanted and still want today. What I mean by this is that during this period in the industry, I feel like we saw a nice blend of 3 core things. 1. Creativity, 2. High production values, and 3. Developers and publishers willing to take risks that they aren't willing to take today. For me, there is no better example of this than EA Sports Big, or, as you may know it,
EA Sports.
Now, after hearing that little piece of nostalgia, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, I remember EA Sports Big, that subdivision of EA was pretty cool. Whatever happened to those guys? Well, friend, you're in the right place, because today's topic is the rise and fall of EA Sports Big. In 2021, EA, and EA Sports especially, doesn't quite have the reputation of a company that champions creativity and is willing to put its money behind something a little more different. At one point or another, there is a very good chance that you've played, or at least heard of, a game from this EA subdivision. Sadly, they're not around anymore, but when they were at their peak, they produced some of the most fun games I've ever played, and I struggle to find anyone who has a bad word to say about their titles. Recently, I grew curious about exactly what happened to them, and after doing a bit of searching around, I didn't find many videos on the subject, so I thought I might as well be the one to do it. And now, here we are. So where does this story begin? Well, it begins with one man joining EA Sports in 1991 by the name of Steven Rechtschaffner. Now, Rechtschaffner had a long and varied career before making his way over to Electronic Arts. He was a professional freestyle skier for the US in the late 70s and 80s. His career also included time in TV production for Fox TV, and he also spent time at watchmaker Swatch, helping build up the brand for around 6 years. In 1991, Rechtschaffner found his way into the gaming industry by becoming a producer for EA Canada as he assisted EA with their sports titles. Apparently his time as an athlete and TV producer made him a perfect candidate to guide the company as they were trying to figure things out from the transition of 2D games to 3D games. After close to a decade at the company, Rechtschaffner's influence grew, and he gained the trust of many of the higher-ups, which afforded him the opportunity to pursue his own passion projects. The first passion project was working on an engine for a new snowboarding franchise. In a 2018 interview with US Gamer, Rechtschaffner explained his goal for the engine he was working on. He stated, "My approach to the whole thing was trying to build it at an arcade or Nintendo level quality, and really making it about fun. Not about being a simulation, but having great physics and control, things anybody could pick up and play, but it would be hard to really master the game." Over time, this engine would turn into what we all know as SSX, and after complications with Sega and the Dreamcast, found its way over to Sony, who were preparing their launch for their brand new console, the PlayStation 2. Sony was so impressed with the early demos that they did everything they could to have SSX as part of their launch lineup. It seemed that Rechtschaffner's goal of trying to combine fun and strong controls had worked. He commented, "I think people were blown away by the quality of the gameplay, the visuals, and the pace of it. It was also at a time when most of EA's games had kind of been below the mark on the quality level." What is interesting about the story at this point is that although everybody at Sony was more than impressed, apparently not everybody at EA was entirely convinced. So much so that some people even suggested he end production on SSX, and the only reason he was allowed to continue with this passion project was because of his previous success and track record. Rechtschaffner stated, "EA had a concept called earning a silver bullet. If you built a game that was successful, you earned a silver bullet, which meant you could build an idea forward. You had the opportunity to try something, even if you were to fail, as long as you were building on top of a success." In the run-up to the game's release, when things were looking more positive, Rechtschaffner pushed EA for a brand new publishing brand to help the game and other future experimental titles stand out a little more, while also connecting back to EA Sports. And so, EA Sports Big was born. Needless to say, SSX was available on day one of the US PS2 launch on the 30th of October 2000, and was arguably the system's most successful launch title with a staggering aggregate review score of 93 out of 100. So here you have a brand new IP that was nothing like anyone had seen before in the genre, built on strong gameplay but also impressive visually, and it's launching on what will become the best-selling console ever, and millions of people are just itching to buy games for the system. It was about as close to a perfect scenario that you could get for a launch of a new franchise and publishing brand. As a result of the success of SSX, the rest of the studios at EA obviously began to take notice, and suddenly there was an explosion of ideas, and this is the part where things get interesting. Over the next 4 years, EA, through EA Sports Big, would put their money and resources behind 7 brand new franchises on top of their recent hit SSX, and it was full steam ahead in terms of production. The following year, we'd see the arrival of NBA Street, which took the sport of basketball, ran it through the EA Sports Big machine, and produced a game that had players pulling off all sorts of tricks and stylish moves, and leaping 12 feet into the air to dunk a basketball with ease. The arcade-style sports game formula had worked once again, delivering more strong review scores that averaged at 89 out of 100, and it would sell just shy of 2 million copies. Also that year, we'd see SSX Tricky, which is possibly the most well-known EA Sports Big title of the bunch, and for good reason. Even though it was sort of a semi-sequel that updated the original game, the reception was incredible. With an aggregate score of 92, it comfortably sits as one of the highest rated PS2 games of all time, further solidifying it as a fan favourite franchise. In 2002, EA Sports Big would put out 3 new games, all of them in the racing genre, all of them borrowing elements from the popular SSX series, and all of them being met with middling to favourable reviews. First up was the reboot of Sledstorm, a snowmobile racing game that originally saw a much less wacky release on the PS1, but was brought back with a splash of colour and craziness, and even some SSX characters who made cameos if I'm not mistaken. Was it fun? Sure. Was it mind-blowing? Not quite. A few months after that came Freakstyle, a motocross racing game, and again very much in the same vein of comical characters competing in wildly creative environments while pulling off the most stylish moves possible at the same time. Reception on this was decent, at an average of 81, and while it's no means bad, it wasn't quite the highs of SSX and NBA Street. Finishing off 2002 was Shocks, which was a rally racer that leaned far more into the arcade style than simulation. Some people today would probably consider it a bit of a hidden gem due to its unique gameplay and impressive visuals for the time, however it didn't quite make enough of an impact to warrant a sequel. So why didn't these games take off? Well, according to Rechtschaffner, it seemed like EA got a little too excited by the high praise and money rolling in from SSX and pushed forward on some titles a little too quickly. Rechtschaffner himself said, "I could see that some games were looking really cool, but they hadn't figured out the physics and the gameplay, and so people got excited when they got shown a demo video. They went, that's great, let's commit, let's do it, but I could see it wasn't actually fun yet and didn't feel right yet. The problem was people would start building a game before they really had the core of it really nailed, so that happened in a couple of games." In 2003, however, the company had a much stronger year. EA Sports Big would kick off April with what would become a cult classic, Def Jam Vendetta, a personal favourite of mine that combined the rap artists under the Def Jam label and threw them into the wrestling ring to perform some of the most outlandish and brutal moves I've ever seen to date. 2003 was off to a great start. In the same month, NBA got its sequel with NBA Street Volume 2, and it was an improvement on the first game in every way. The gameplay was more expansive, the visuals had more life, the soundtrack featured numerous popular artists, and this was reflected in the strong 9 out of 10 reviews flying in and the 1.6 million in sales. Closing out 2003, SSX was back with SSX3, largely considered the peak of the franchise, and was met with universal acclaim with an aggregate score of 93, and was one of the best-selling games across the 3 main consoles of that time. An incredible year by any measure, with 2 successful sequels and a great start to a brand new franchise. And at this point, as executive producer, Rechtschaffner had been closely involved with a lot of EA Sports Big titles and was always there to ensure that fun was put first, and clearly he achieved quite a lot in this role. His success inevitably took him to new roles within EA as they hoped to utilise his creativity company-wide. The problem was, this pulled him away from working closely with the EA Sports Big titles, and that's where we see a bit of a turning point. So even though he moved on, EA Sports Big pushed forward nonetheless, and it seems like they started to stray away from that proven formula that had worked so well for them in the past, and that's where things start to unravel somewhat. Now, if you're not counting the downgraded ports that would release on the DS and PSP, EA Sports Big would put out 11 games over the next 5 years, and as you work your way down the list, it doesn't make for the best reading. 2004 began with the launch of NFL Street and was called everything from great to okay and repetitive. The reviews and sales were not as big as some of the other hits, but it certainly was not a bad start to another new franchise. Then we jump ahead to December of the same year, and oddly enough comes NFL Street 2. And while fans of the first game were probably over the moon to see a follow-up so quickly, the result of this possibly rushed sequel was that it didn't innovate enough on what came before and was understandably received less favourably. In 2005, continuing the trend of taking a popular sport to the streets, the next focus was FIFA, and if you're going solely by review scores, the original FIFA Street would be their worst game yet with an aggregate score of 59. To be honest, from what I could find, it doesn't seem like it sold terribly, and if I'm talking from a personal perspective, FIFA Street felt like a bit of a borderline cult classic when it released in the UK. Not more than a week after this, NBA Street 3 comes out and pulls things back in the right direction, achieving more stellar reviews like its two predecessors, receiving such praise as deceptively deep and a beauty to behold, as it clearly built on what came before in a meaningful way. In October of that year, they treat us to another SSX sequel in the form of SSX On Tour, another decent game by all accounts, but at the same time it was the lowest rated SSX game so far and a considerable drop from the Game of the Year contenders that the last three games were. Jumping ahead to 2006, we see them take another crack at football with FIFA Street 2. However, the response from most was wildly mixed, as it was clear they hadn't quite nailed the gameplay just yet. NFL Street 3 closes out the year to a similar mixed reception. It was the lowest rated title in the series so far, as things possibly became stagnant and would also be the end of NFL Street. SSX would make another return in 2007 with the Wii exclusive SSX Blur, and from what I can find on the game it seems like it was okay but maybe struggled to utilise the Wii controls properly, and as a result saw the lowest scores to date, meaning we wouldn't see another SSX title until the reboot in 2012. NBA Street Home Court also drops in 07, and although in comparison to the other recent titles from the publisher it does quite well, it still contributes to the trend of falling review scores. In their final year, 2008, we get yet another FIFA Street game that still can't win over the majority of players, and now all three titles have failed to achieve an average score of more than 70 out of 100. And then we have what might be the final nail in the coffin, NFL Tour, a spiritual successor to NFL Street, and a game supposedly so shallow that IGN gave it a 4.5 out of 10. So here we are, 5 years and 11 games after Rechtschaffner's departure, and it seemed like the magic had gone, as only 2 games in that period could really be considered a success, and sadly in 2008, EA Sports Big was shut down. Now, I'm not so naive to think that there weren't many contributing factors that led to the closure of this publisher. In many ways, their poor run of form couldn't have come at a worse time, as around 2008 the world would go into a huge recession, which obviously led EA to make some hard decisions about where they put their money. With the economy in the toilet, it was only natural that EA shifted to a strategy that was more risk-averse, but this approach had already crept into the boardrooms during Rechtschaffner's tenure. He mentioned, "I think it shifted to become much more marketing-focused, much more new feature focus for a number of years, and I think that hurt big franchises like FIFA, where the gameplay kinda got stagnant even though there were all those marketable features. It left them vulnerable to competition." Now, although EA Sports Big was done and dusted, EA did actually try and start things up again with a new publishing brand for arcade sports titles, under the name EA Freestyle. And you're probably thinking, oh, I've never heard of that name before, but don't worry, because they only put out 3 games before being shut down again, and the most notable of those was the boxing game Facebreaker. And that, sadly, is the end of the story. What started with one man's idea to create sports titles that put fun first, bloomed into an unbelievable run of well-received and much-loved games that tragically fizzled out when everyone got a little too excited and eager to crank out sequel after sequel. I think it's a good example of what can go wrong if you don't build from a solid foundation first, and you have to kind of wonder if the closure of EA Sports Big led us to the EA that we have today, an EA that isn't willing to get a little creative from time to time or back anything that won't guarantee ridiculous profits, but most importantly an EA that won't use all of its money and resources and franchises it has access to go for something truly groundbreaking. Will we ever see days like this again? Probably not, because let's face it, the industry is a much bigger and complex machine today than it was in the early 2000s, but we can all hope and dream. Yes, we can all hope and dream. Anyway, if you like this video, then you already know what to do, and if you're a fan of EA Sports Big, then, jump in the comments, tell me about your favourite title. That's going to wrap it up for this video. I've been Inept Saiyan, you as always have been a wonderful audience, and I hope to see you next time.